I watched from my kitchen window as the propane tank I'd filled 3 days earlier rolled away on the back of a flatbed truck. And the only explanation I got was a neon orange violation notice taped to my front door stating I'd violated community guidelines during a state of emergency. My name is Quentin Norris, and I'd lived in the Meadowbrook Heights subdivision in Tulsa, Oklahoma, for exactly 9 months when the ice storm hit. February in Oklahoma can be unpredictable, but nobody expected what rolled through that weekend. The news kept calling it a once-in-a-generation event, the kind of storm that shuts down entire cities and leaves people without power for weeks. I prepared like any reasonable person would. I stocked up on bottled water, canned goods, batteries, and most importantly, I'd filled my 200-gallon propane tank to capacity. That tank ran my backup generator, and in weather like this, a generator wasn't a luxury. It was survival. The storm hit on a Friday night. By Saturday morning, the entire neighborhood looked like a frozen wasteland. Ice coated everything, tree branches sagged under the weight, and power lines came down on Maple Street and Cherry Avenue. Our street, Oakwood Drive, lost power around 6 in the morning. I heard the hum of my refrigerator die, saw the lights flicker once, then darkness. Well, darkness except for my house. I had that generator and I had it hooked up properly. I'd even paid an electrician $800 to install a transfer switch, so I could power essential circuits without burning my house down or electrocuting some poor utility worker. My neighbor to the left, an elderly veteran named Carl Morrison, came over around 8 that morning. His breath made clouds in the frigid air as he stood on my front porch, shivering despite the 3 layers I could see he was wearing. "Quentin, I hate to ask, but do you have any way I could charge my wife's medical equipment? She needs her oxygen concentrator, and our battery backup only lasts about 4 hours. Get her over here," I said immediately. "I've got power, and I've got plenty of propane to keep this thing running for weeks if I need to." Carl's eyes actually teared up. "Thank you." I was starting to panic. Over the next few hours, 3 other neighbors ended up at my place. The Hendersons from across the street brought their 2 young kids and asked if they could warm up and charge their phones. A single mom named Rachel from 2 houses down came over with her infant son after her house dropped below 50 degrees. I set everyone up in my living room, made coffee, and tried to keep spirits up while the ice continued to fall outside. That's when she showed up. Her name was Brenda Carmichael, and she was the president of the Meadowbrook Heights Homeowners Association. I'd had minimal interaction with her before this, just a terse welcome letter when I moved in that was more threatening than welcoming, listing about 40 things I wasn't allowed to do with my own property. She was in her late 40s, with blonde hair that looked like she'd just come from the salon even in the middle of an ice storm, and she wore this permanent expression like she'd just smelled something rotten. She didn't knock. She just opened my front door and walked in, clipboard in hand. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the conversations happening in my living room. "I need to speak with the homeowner." I stood up from where I'd been helping Carl set up his wife's oxygen machine. "That would be me. Can I help you? I'm Brenda Carmichael, HOA president. I'm going around checking on properties during this emergency situation." Her eyes swept across my living room, taking in my neighbors, the extension cords, the oxygen machine, the kids playing on their tablets in the corner. "It appears you're running a generator." "That's right. The power's been out for hours, and I've got neighbors who need electricity for medical equipment." She made a note on her clipboard. "The HOA bylaws clearly state that generators must be approved in advance, and can only be operated during specified hours to minimize noise pollution. I stared at her. It's a state of emergency. People need heat and power. The rules don't stop applying just because of weather, she said. Also, I need to inform you that the HOA board held an emergency meeting last night via conference call. We've determined that all propane tanks in the neighborhood constitute a community resource during this crisis. We'll be collecting them and redistributing the fuel to ensure equitable distribution. You'll be doing what? It's in Section 47 of the HOA bylaws. During states of emergency, the board has authority to commandeer resources for the common good. Your propane tank is oversized anyway. According to our records, the maximum tank size approved for this neighborhood is 100 gallons. Yours is 200. My jaw clenched. I got approval for that tank when I installed it. I have the email from the Architectural Review Committee. I have no record of that approval, Brenda said, making another note. Regardless, we'll be by to collect the tank this afternoon. Please ensure someone is available to facilitate the transfer. You're not taking my propane, I said flatly. She looked up from her clipboard and her eyes went cold. Mr. Norris, you can cooperate or you can face fines. The choice is yours. Fine me then. You're not taking my property. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. We'll see about that. After she left, Carl looked at me with concern. Can she actually do that? I have no idea, I admitted, but I'm going to find out. I spent the next hour digging through the massive packet of HOA documents I'd been given when I closed on the house. Most people probably don't read these things, but I'd skimmed them. I'd never seen anything about commandeering private property during emergencies. Section 47, which Brenda had cited, was actually about snow removal from common areas. It had nothing to do with confiscating propane tanks. But I didn't get a chance to confront her about it because at 2 in the afternoon, a flatbed truck pulled up to my house. 2 men got out, along with Brenda and another woman I recognized as Sharon Whitmore, the HOA vice president. I went outside, the cold hitting me like a physical force. What do you think you're doing? We explained this earlier, Brenda said. We're collecting the propane tank. You have no legal authority to do that. We have every authority granted to us by the HOA covenants you agreed to when you purchased this property. She gestured to the 2 men, who I now realized were probably just guys she'd hired off some app. Gentlemen, the tank is around the side of the house. I stepped in front of them. You're not touching my tank. Mr. Norris, you're in violation of multiple HOA regulations, Sharon said, pulling out her phone. Your generator is creating excessive noise. Your propane tank was never properly approved, and now you're interfering with official HOA business during a declared neighborhood emergency. Your declared emergency doesn't override my property rights. Brenda sighed like I was a particularly stupid child. The fines for non-compliance during an emergency are $500 per day. Is that really worth it to you? You're not taking my tank, I repeated. She nodded to the 2 men. Go ahead. I pulled out my phone. If you touch my property, I'm calling the police. One of the men hesitated, but Brenda waved him forward. The police have better things to do during an ice storm than deal with HOA disputes. We're within our rights. I dialed 911, but the call wouldn't go through. The cell towers were probably overloaded or damaged. I tried again. Nothing. The men disconnected my propane tank while I stood there, furious and helpless. The whole process took maybe 10 minutes. They loaded it onto the flatbed, strapped it down, and drove away. Brenda handed me a bright orange violation notice. You'll receive documentation of your fines in the mail, she said. Have a good day, Mr. Norris. My generator ran for another 2 hours on the residual propane in the lines, and then it died. The house started getting cold immediately. Carl came over, his face pale. "They took your tank." "Yeah. What are we going to do about Margaret's oxygen?" I thought fast. "Does your car have gas?" "About half a tank. We can charge the backup battery from your car if we need to. It's not ideal, but it'll work." The temperature in my house dropped to 45 degrees by nightfall. The Hendersons had gone back home and piled their kids under blankets. Rachel and her baby were still at my place because her house was even colder. Carl's wife, Margaret, was set up in my guest room with her oxygen concentrator, running off a battery we'd charged from Carl's car in shifts. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about that propane tank, about Brenda's smug expression, about the casual way she'd stolen my property and acted like it was perfectly legal. When dawn finally came, gray and cold through my windows, I made a decision. I was going to bury her in paperwork and reports until she regretted ever messing with me. The ice storm lasted 3 more days. The power came back on Tuesday afternoon, and by Wednesday, life was starting to return to normal. My first stop was the Tulsa Police Department. I filed a theft report for the propane tank, including the approximate value of $800 for the tank and propane combined. The officer taking my report, a tired-looking guy named Officer Davidson, listened to my story and sighed. "This is an HOA dispute, sir. We really can't get involved in civil matters." "She stole my property," I said. "How is that civil?" "Because you signed a contract with the HOA when you bought your house. If they're claiming authority under that contract, it's a civil matter. You'd need to take it up with a lawyer." "So if I went to her house and took her TV, that would be theft. But because she's HOA president, she can take whatever she wants." "I'm not saying it's right, sir. I'm saying it's complicated. File a small claims case if you want your property back." I left the police station frustrated but not defeated. Next stop was the Oklahoma Corporation Commission, which oversees propane and fuel regulations. I filed a complaint about the improper handling and transportation of propane by unlicensed individuals. That got more traction. The woman I spoke with, a regulatory specialist named Mrs. Patterson, actually looked concerned. "They just disconnected the tank and hauled it away. Were the technicians certified?" "I seriously doubt it. They looked like day laborers." "That's a safety violation. Propane tanks have to be disconnected and transported by licensed professionals. There are regulations about this." She typed something into her computer. "I'm opening an investigation. Can you provide the HOA's contact information?" I gave her everything, including Brenda's personal cell phone number. Next, I contacted the Oklahoma Attorney General's office and filed a consumer complaint. Then I reached out to the Federal Emergency Management Agency because the state had declared the ice storm a disaster area, and I was pretty sure confiscating emergency supplies during a declared disaster was illegal on a federal level. But I wasn't done. I started digging into the HOA itself, really reading through those bylaws and covenants. What I found was fascinating. Brenda had been president for 6 years, which was actually longer than the bylaws allowed. According to the documents, board members could serve a maximum of 2 consecutive 2-year terms before they had to step down for at least 1 election cycle. She should have been termed out 2 years ago. I also found out that the HOA was required to hold quarterly meetings open to all homeowners, publish meeting minutes, maintain transparent financial records, and follow Robert's Rules of Order for all official business. I requested copies of the last 2 years of meeting minutes and financial statements. It took 3 written requests and a threat to file a complaint with the state before I got anything, and what I got was suspicious as hell. The financial records showed that the HOA had collected over $300,000 in annual dues from the 240 homes in the neighborhood. That's about $1,250 per house per year, which matched what I was paying. But the expenses were vague. Common area maintenance was listed at $90,000, but our common areas consisted of a small entrance sign and a few flower beds that maybe got weeded twice a year. Administrative expenses were $75,000 annually. For what? Brenda's salary was listed at $48,000 per year, which seemed high for running an HOA in a subdivision this size. I made copies of everything and started documenting other violations I'd noticed. The HOA had never properly filed their corporate registration with the state. They were operating as a nonprofit corporation, but hadn't maintained their status. Their tax-exempt status had actually lapsed 3 years ago, which meant they'd been collecting dues as a non-registered entity. 2 weeks after the storm, I got a letter from the HOA's lawyer, a guy named Mitchell Freeman. The letter informed me that I owed $6,500 in fines, $500 per day for 13 days, starting from when I'd refused to comply with the generator regulations. The letter demanded payment within 30 days or they'd place a lien on my property. I called Freeman's office and got through to him on the second try. "Mr. Freeman, I'm calling about the fine letter I received." "Ah, yes, Mr. Norris. The HOA has been very clear about your violations." "The violations that your client made up. The section of the bylaws she cited doesn't say what she claims it says. I've read the entire covenant. The board has broad discretionary authority during emergencies. Show me where it says they can confiscate private property." There was a pause. "I'd need to review the specific language." "You should do that," I said, "because I don't think you've actually read the documents. I also think you should know that I've filed complaints with the Oklahoma Corporation Commission, the Attorney General's Office, FEMA, and the Tulsa Police Department. Your client stole my property, violated state safety regulations, and is attempting to extort me with illegal fines." Another pause, longer this time. "Mr. Norris, I'm sure we can resolve this amicably. I want my propane tank returned, all fines dropped, and a written apology. Then we can talk about being amicable. I'll discuss this with my client." He didn't sound confident. 3 days later, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was an investigator from the Oklahoma Corporation Commission named Raymond Torres. "Mr. Norris, I wanted to update you on the complaint you filed. We conducted an inspection of the propane handling practices used by the Meadowbrook Heights HOA, and we found multiple violations. They transported a residential propane tank without proper licensing, failed to follow safety protocols during disconnection, and couldn't provide documentation of where the tank is currently located or how the propane was redistributed." What does that mean for them? It means they're looking at fines of $10,000 for the safety violations and an additional $5,000 per tank if they confiscated any others. We're still investigating the scope. I understand they took tanks from 6 properties total. I felt a grim satisfaction. So they're looking at $40,000 in fines, at minimum. If we determine that they put people at risk or caused any property damage through improper handling, it could go higher. There's also the matter of operating without proper licensing. The HOA would need to be registered as a propane dealer to collect and redistribute fuel, which they're not. "Good," I said simply. "We'll keep you updated on the investigation. You should also know that we're required to refer potential criminal violations to local law enforcement. The unlicensed transportation of hazardous materials can be a criminal matter." After I hung up, I allowed myself a small smile. Then I got back to work. I filed a formal complaint with the Oklahoma Real Estate Commission because HOA board members have fiduciary duties, and misusing their authority constitutes a breach of those duties. I contacted every major news station in Tulsa and sent them the story. 3 of them responded with interest, but one, Channel 8 News, was particularly eager. They sent out a reporter named Jessica Young and a cameraman the following Monday. Jessica was sharp, in her early 30s, with questions that showed she'd done her homework. So the HOA president confiscated your emergency supplies during a state-declared disaster. That's right. My propane tank was running a generator that was powering medical equipment for my neighbor's wife. When they took the tank, we had to scramble to keep her oxygen concentrator running. And they claimed they had the legal authority to do this. They claimed it was in the HOA bylaws. It wasn't. I've read every page of those documents. What they did was theft, plain and simple. The story aired that Thursday evening. Jessica had done a full investigation, not just covering my situation, but interviewing the other 5 homeowners whose propane tanks had been confiscated. One of them, a woman named Patricia Dunham, had a disabled son who needed powered medical equipment. Another family had lost all the food in their freezer because their backup power was taken away. The kicker was that Jessica had also tracked down where the propane went. Brenda had distributed most of it to board members and their friends. She'd kept 1 full tank for her own house. Only a fraction had gone to people who actually needed it for medical or emergency purposes. The public response was immediate and brutal. The HOA's email and phone lines were flooded with complaints. People started showing up at board meetings, which had previously been poorly attended. The local homeowners' rights advocacy groups got involved. A lawyer named Thomas Brennan, who specialized in HOA disputes, reached out and offered to represent me pro bono because he said the case was so egregious it would set important precedent. Brenda tried to fight back. She sent out a neighborhood-wide email claiming I was a troublemaker trying to undermine the HOA's authority, and that everything they'd done was legal and proper. She attached a legal opinion from Mitchell Freeman backing her up. Thomas Brennan tore that legal opinion apart in about 10 minutes. "This is embarrassing," he said when we met at a coffee shop near my house. "Freeman either didn't read the bylaws or he's intentionally misrepresenting them. The section about emergency powers doesn't grant authority over private property. It allows the board to restrict access to common areas for safety reasons. That's it. So the fines are bogus, completely. In fact, by imposing fines without proper authority, the board has opened themselves up to legal action. You could sue for harassment and abuse of power." "I want to do more than sue," I said. "I want her removed from the board, and I want a full audit of the HOA's finances. Something doesn't add up with their spending." Thomas's eyes lit up. "Now that's interesting. Tell me more." I showed him the financial documents I'd obtained. He studied them carefully, making notes. "You're right to be suspicious. These numbers don't make sense. Common area maintenance shouldn't cost anywhere near $90,000 for a neighborhood this size, and administrative expenses at $75,000. That's absurd." He tapped the page. "I think your HOA president has been embezzling. Can we prove it? We can force a full forensic audit. Once we start pulling on this thread, if there's fraud, we'll find it." The board meeting that month was standing room only. Over 100 homeowners showed up, many of them angry about the propane confiscation, but others just curious about what had been happening with their money. I arrived early and sat in the front row. Thomas Brennan sat beside me, his briefcase full of documents. Brenda called the meeting to order. looking nervous for the first time since I'd known her. Sharon Whitmore sat beside her, along with the other 3 board members. A middle-aged man named George Patterson, a younger woman named Linda Hayes, and an older gentleman named Robert Chen. They all looked uncomfortable. "Before we begin regular business," Brenda said, "I want to address the recent unfounded allegations that have been circulating in the media and online." "Point of order," Thomas said, standing up. "Before you make any statements, I want to inform the board that I'm representing Mr. Quentin Norris in a legal action against this HOA for theft, harassment, abuse of authority, and potential fraud. Anything said in this meeting can and will be used in legal proceedings." The room went dead silent. Brenda's face flushed red. "You can't do that. This is an HOA meeting, not a courtroom. It's a public meeting of a homeowners association, and I'm a homeowner's legal representative. I have every right to be here. Now I have several motions to present." "You're not on the agenda," Sharon said. "According to your own bylaws, any homeowner can introduce motions during the homeowner forum portion of the meeting. I'm invoking that right now." Brenda looked like she wanted to argue, but George Patterson leaned over and whispered something to her. She sat back, arms crossed. "Fine," she said. "State your motion." Motion number 1. Immediate return of all confiscated propane tanks and fuel to their rightful owners, along with compensation for any fuel used or damages incurred. "Seconded," someone called from the back. It was Carl Morrison. "All in favor," Thomas said, looking at the board. Brenda didn't move. Neither did Sharon. But George, Linda, and Robert all raised their hands slowly. "Motion passes 3-2, Thomas said. "Let the record show that the board has voted to return the property." Motion number 2. A full forensic audit of all HOA finances for the past 6 years, to be conducted by an independent accounting firm. This time, nobody on the board moved. "I'll second that motion," said a woman I didn't know from the middle of the room. "All in favor." The room erupted with raised hands. Every homeowner present voted in favor. The board had no choice. "Motion passes by overwhelming majority," Thomas said. Motion number 3. Immediate resignation of President Brenda Carmichael for violation of term limits as specified in the HOA bylaws, abuse of authority, and potential financial impropriety, pending the results of the audit. The room exploded with noise. People were shouting, some in support, some in protest. Brenda stood up, her face purple with rage. "This is a witch hunt. I've given 6 years of my life to this neighborhood." "6 years you weren't entitled to serve," Thomas said calmly. "According to the bylaws, you should have stepped down 2 years ago. Every decision you've made since then has been without proper authority." "That's ridiculous. The bylaws were amended. Show me the amendment. Show me the vote where homeowners approved extending term limits." Brenda opened her mouth, then closed it. There was no such vote because it had never happened. George Patterson stood up. "Brenda, I think you should step down. This has gotten out of hand." "George, you coward," Sharon hissed, but Linda and Robert were nodding in agreement with George. "I'm not resigning," Brenda said. "You can't make me." "Then we'll vote you out," Thomas said. "All in favor of removing Brenda Carmichael from the board for violation of bylaws and abuse of authority." The vote was nearly unanimous. Only Sharon voted against it. Even some of Brenda's former supporters had turned on her after seeing the evidence. Brenda grabbed her things, her hands shaking. "You people have no idea what you've done. This neighborhood will fall apart without me." "I think we'll manage," I said. She shot me a look of pure hatred and stormed out. Sharon followed her, muttering about lawsuits. The meeting continued for another hour. George Patterson was elected temporary president until a proper election could be held. The board voted to drop all fines against me and the other homeowners who'd been targeted. They also voted to cooperate fully with all ongoing investigations. After the meeting, at least a dozen homeowners came up to thank me. Patricia Dunham, the woman with the disabled son, actually hugged me. "You stood up when the rest of us were too scared," she said. "Thank you." But the story wasn't over yet. The forensic audit took 6 weeks and cost the HOA $12,000, but what it revealed was worth every penny. Brenda Carmichael had embezzled over $200,000 from the HOA over the course of her presidency. She'd done it through fake invoices, inflated contracts with companies she had connections to, and straight-up transfers to her personal accounts disguised as reimbursements for expenses she never actually incurred. The auditors found that the actual cost of maintaining the neighborhood's common areas should have been around $15,000 per year, not $90,000. The excess had been funneled through a landscaping company owned by Brenda's brother-in-law, who had then kicked back a percentage to her. The administrative expenses were similarly inflated. She'd been paying herself $48,000 a year, plus another $30,000 in consulting fees that were completely bogus. I was sitting in my living room when Thomas called with the news. "Quentin, you're not going to believe what they found." "Actually, you probably will believe it because you suspected something was wrong. Embezzlement, over $200,000. The auditors have referred it to the Tulsa County District Attorney's Office for criminal prosecution." I felt a cold satisfaction settle over me. Good. The district attorney moved fast. The evidence was clear-cut, and Brenda had been sloppy about covering her tracks. They arrested her on a Tuesday morning. I heard about it from Carl, who heard about it from his wife, who heard about it from the neighborhood Facebook group that I'd never joined. "They charged her with embezzlement, fraud, and theft," Carl said. We were standing in his driveway enjoying an unusually warm spring afternoon. "She's looking at serious prison time." "What about Sharon?" She had to know what was going on. "Apparently they're investigating her too, but it's unclear if she was involved or just incompetent." Sharon Whitmore resigned from the board a week later, claiming health reasons. Nobody believed her. The Oklahoma Corporation Commission hit the HOA with $45,000 in fines for the propane violations. Since Brenda was no longer in charge and the new board was cooperating, they worked out a payment plan and implemented proper safety training. My propane tank was returned, along with a check for $800 to compensate for the fuel that had been used and the inconvenience. The criminal case against Brenda moved through the system. She tried to fight it at first, hiring an expensive defense attorney who claimed she'd made accounting errors, but hadn't intended to defraud anyone. The prosecution destroyed that argument by showing the fake invoices and the paper trail of money flowing to her personal accounts. In October, 8 months after the ice storm, Brenda Carmichael pled guilty to embezzlement and fraud charges. She was sentenced to 5 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 3, ordered to pay full restitution of $212,000 to the HOA, and banned from ever serving on an HOA board again. I didn't go to the sentencing hearing. I didn't need to. It was enough to know that justice had been done. The HOA held proper elections in November. George Patterson was elected president legitimately, and the board brought in 3 new members who actually seemed interested in serving the community rather than enriching themselves. They lowered the annual dues to $800, which was more than enough to cover actual expenses with a reasonable reserve fund. One Saturday afternoon, in early December, Carl and I were working on his fence when he brought up the whole saga. You know, you could have just let it go after they returned your tank. Nobody would have blamed you. I hammered in another nail before responding. I thought about it, but it wasn't just about me. She was stealing from all of us, abusing her power and getting away with it because nobody wanted to make waves. Someone had to push back. Well, I'm glad it was you. Margaret and I talked about it a lot. If you hadn't fought them, who knows what would have happened to other people in the future? Probably the same thing that happened to us. Brenda was only getting bolder. Eventually, she would have crossed a line she couldn't come back from, but a lot more people would have been hurt first. We finished the fence as the sun set, painting the Oklahoma sky in shades of orange and pink. My house was warm, my propane tank was full, and I had a neighborhood full of people who'd learned an important lesson about standing up to petty tyrants who think a title gives them unlimited power. The following spring, the HOA organized a neighborhood barbecue at the small park in our common area. It was one of the first community events in years that actually felt like a community. People brought food, kids ran around playing, and for the first time since I'd moved to Meadowbrook Heights, it felt like a real neighborhood instead of a subdivision ruled by an authoritarian board. Patricia Dunham brought her famous potato salad, and Carl grilled hamburgers and hot dogs. The new board members actually mingled with residents instead of lording over them. George Patterson gave a short speech thanking everyone for getting involved and promising transparency going forward. Halfway through the event, a woman approached me. I recognized her as Emily, though I'd never caught her last name. She lived on Cherry Avenue and had been one of the homeowners who'd lost her propane during the storm. "I never got a chance to properly thank you," she said. "When they took my propane, I felt so helpless. I didn't know what to do or who to turn to. Watching you fight back gave me hope that things could actually change. You don't need to thank me. We all deserved better. Still, it took courage to do what you did. Most people would have just paid the fines and moved on." I thought about that. Maybe. But I grew up with a father who taught me that you don't let bullies get away with it. Whether it's on a playground or in a homeowners association, the principle is the same. The only way they stop is if someone stands up to them. She smiled. "Your father sounds like a smart man." He was. He passed away 3 years ago, but I think he would have gotten a kick out of this whole situation. The barbecue lasted until dusk. As people started packing up and heading home, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. The ice storm felt like it had been years ago instead of just over a year. So much had changed since that frozen February morning when I'd watched my propane tank roll away on a flatbed truck. I'd bought the house in Meadowbrook Heights because it seemed like a nice, quiet neighborhood where I could settle down after years of moving around for work. I'm a civil engineer, and my career had taken me all over the country, from highway projects in Montana, bridge inspections in Florida. Tulsa was supposed to be my permanent home, the place where I finally put down roots. The HOA drama had been an unexpected complication, but in a weird way, it had actually helped me connect with my neighbors more than I might have otherwise. Going through a crisis together, fighting a common enemy, had created bonds that might not have formed in normal circumstances. Thomas Brennan became a friend. We'd grab lunch occasionally, and he'd update me on other HOA cases he was working on. Apparently, my case had given him a reputation as the guy to call when HOA boards overstepped their authority. He was currently representing a homeowner in Broken Arrow, whose HOA was trying to foreclose over a dispute about lawn ornaments. "Your case changed how I practice law," he told me one afternoon over coffee. "I used to think HOA disputes were petty and not worth my time. But seeing how much power these boards have and how easily that power can be abused, I realized there's a real need for lawyers willing to fight these battles. I'm glad something good came out of it. More than something. The publicity from your case led to state legislators looking at HOA reform laws. There's a bill working through the State House right now that would require independent audits for all HOAs over a certain size and create stronger protections for homeowners against retaliatory fines. I hadn't known that. Really. Your fight might end up helping thousands of homeowners across Oklahoma. That put things in perspective. What had started as me being stubborn about my property rights had turned into something bigger. The months rolled on. Summer came, hot and humid like Oklahoma summers always are. I installed a pool in my backyard, and after the proper approval process with the new, reasonable HOA board, it was completed by July. I invited the neighbors over for a pool party. Carl and Margaret came, along with the Hendersons, Patricia and her son, and about a dozen other families from the street. It was during that party that Carl pulled me aside. "I've been meaning to tell you something," he said. We were standing by the grill, away from the noise of the pool. After the ice storm, after everything that happened with Brenda, Margaret and I were talking about moving. We'd lived here for 20 years, but we were so disgusted with how things were being run that we considered selling. I didn't know that. We didn't tell anyone. But then you fought back, and things started changing, and we realized we didn't want to leave after all. This is our home. We just needed someone to remind us that we had the power to make it better. His words hit me harder than I expected. "I'm glad you stayed, Carl. You and Margaret are good people. So are you, Quentin. So are you." That fall, the HOA organized another neighborhood meeting, this time to discuss long-term improvements to the common areas. The old board had let things deteriorate while funneling money into Brenda's pockets. Now, with proper financial management, there was actually money available for real improvements. The residents voted to upgrade the playground equipment, add better lighting along the walking paths, and create a community garden. These were the kinds of projects an HOA should be doing, things that actually improved the neighborhood and brought people together. I volunteered to help with the community garden, using my engineering background to design an efficient irrigation system. It became a weekend project that a dozen residents worked on together. We built raised beds, installed the watering system, and planted vegetables and flowers. By the following spring, the garden was producing tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, and enough zucchini to supply the entire neighborhood. One afternoon, while I was working in the garden, a man I didn't recognize approached. He was in his 30s, casually dressed, and looked nervous. "Are you Quentin Norris?" "That's me." "I'm David Marshall. I just bought a house 2 streets over. I wanted to introduce myself and thank you." "Thank you for what?" "For cleaning up the HOA. When I was doing my due diligence before buying, I read about what happened with the previous board. I almost didn't buy here because of it, but then I saw that there had been major reforms. If it weren't for you pushing for those changes, I probably would have bought in a different neighborhood. It was strange to think that my actions were still affecting new people moving into the area. Well, welcome to Meadowbrook Heights. It's a good place now. I can tell. Everyone I've met has been friendly. It's not what I expected from an HOA neighborhood. We talked for a while about the neighborhood, the amenities, the upcoming events. David mentioned that he and his wife were expecting their first child and wanted a safe, stable place to raise a family. "You picked a good spot," I assured him. "Just stay involved with the HOA. Go to the meetings, vote in elections, hold the board accountable. That's how we make sure what happened before doesn't happen again." "I will. I definitely will." As David walked away, I realized that this was the legacy of the whole mess with Brenda. It wasn't just about getting my propane tank back or seeing her prosecuted for embezzlement. It was about creating a culture of accountability and community involvement that would outlast any individual incident. The holidays came around again. It had been almost 2 years since the ice storm. The HOA organized a neighborhood holiday lights contest, something that hadn't been done in years. Carl went all out, covering his house in thousands of twinkling lights. The Hendersons created an elaborate nativity scene. I kept it simple with white icicle lights along my roofline and a lit tree in the front window on Christmas Eve. The neighborhood came together for caroling. It was cheesy and old-fashioned, but people seemed genuinely happy to participate. We walked from house to house, singing off key versions of classic carols, drinking hot chocolate, and enjoying the decorated neighborhood. Standing in the middle of Oakwood Drive, surrounded by neighbors who'd become friends, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: contentment. This was home, not just the house I owned, but the community I'd helped protect and improve. Brenda Carmichael was in prison, serving her sentence. I didn't think about her much anymore. She'd made her choices, and she was facing the consequences. Meanwhile, the rest of us were building something better in the space she'd left behind. The new year brought more changes. George Patterson decided not to run for re-election as HOA president, saying he'd only stepped up during the crisis and wanted someone else to take over. The election was competitive in a healthy way, with 3 qualified candidates running. A woman named Susan Rodriguez won, and she brought fresh energy and good ideas to the role. One of Susan's first initiatives was to create a neighborhood emergency preparedness plan, ironically inspired by the ice storm that had started everything. The plan included designated shelter locations, a database of residents with medical needs, and proper protocols for handling emergencies without violating anyone's rights or seizing their property. "We learned some hard lessons," Susan said at the meeting where the plan was presented. "Let's make sure we don't have to learn them again." The plan passed unanimously. In March, I received an unexpected letter from the Oklahoma Attorney General's office. It was a formal commendation for my role in exposing fraud and corruption in the Meadowbrook Heights HOA. The letter praised my persistence and civic responsibility, noting that my actions had led to multiple investigations and reforms that protected other homeowners across the state. I framed the letter and hung it in my home office, not out of pride but as a reminder. A reminder that one person can make a difference. That standing up to injustice matters. That property rights and community responsibility aren't mutually exclusive. That spring, 2 years after the ice storm, I was working in my garden when I saw a news van pull up on the street. Jessica Young got out, followed by her cameraman. She waved when she saw me. "Quentin, I hoped I'd find you home." "Jessica, what brings you by?" "I'm doing a follow-up story on the HOA reform bill that just passed the state legislature. It's being called the Meadowbrook Heights Act because your case was the catalyst. I was hoping to get an interview." The bill, which had finally made it through both chambers and been signed by the governor, created significant new protections for homeowners. It required annual independent financial reviews for HOAs with more than 50 homes, established clearer limits on fines and enforcement actions, created an appeals process for homeowners disputing HOA decisions, and made it easier to remove board members who violated their fiduciary duties. We did the interview in my backyard. Jessica asked about the ice storm, the propane confiscation, the investigation, and the aftermath. "Looking back now, 2 years later, do you think it was worth it?" she asked. "Absolutely. It wasn't just about me or my propane tank. It was about establishing that HOAs can't abuse their authority without consequences. These organizations have immense power over people's homes and lives. That power needs to be checked and balanced. Some people say HOAs are necessary for maintaining property values and neighborhood standards. I don't disagree. A well-run HOA can be a good thing, but the key is well-run. That requires transparency, accountability, and homeowners who stay involved. The problems happen when boards become little fiefdoms run by people who forget they're supposed to serve the community, not rule over it. The story aired that week, part of a longer segment about HOA reform across Oklahoma. They interviewed me, other homeowners who'd been affected, Thomas Brennan, state legislators who championed the reform bill, and experts on property law. The segment ended with Jessica's closing commentary. The story of Meadowbrook Heights is a reminder that ordinary citizens can create extraordinary change. One man's refusal to accept an unjust situation led to criminal prosecution, financial reforms, and state legislation that will protect homeowners for generations. It started with a stolen propane tank during an ice storm. It ended with justice. After the segment aired, I got calls and emails from people across the country dealing with their own HOA nightmares. I tried to help where I could, sharing what I'd learned and connecting people with resources. Thomas Brennan's practice expanded to include consultations with homeowners nationwide. The ripples from that February morning kept spreading wider. By summer, Meadowbrook Heights had become something of a model community. Other neighborhoods sent representatives to our HOA meetings to learn how we operated. Susan Rodriguez gave presentations about transparency and community engagement. The whole situation had transformed from a cautionary tale into a success story. One evening in late June, I was sitting on my back porch with a beer, watching the sun set when Carl came over. "Mind if I join you?" "Not at all." He settled into the chair beside me, his own beer in hand. We sat in comfortable silence for a while. "You ever regret it?" Carl finally asked. "All the stress, the legal battles, the time it took," I thought about it. "No. I regret that it was necessary, but I don't regret doing it. Margaret and I have been talking. We're putting together a scholarship fund for kids in the neighborhood who want to study law or public service. We wanted to name it after you." I was surprised. "Carl, you don't need to do that." "We want to. What you did mattered, Quentin. You showed people that they don't have to accept corruption or abuse of power. That's a lesson worth passing on." "Then I'm honored. Thank you." The scholarship fund launched that fall, with contributions from dozens of families in the neighborhood. It would award $2,000 annually to a graduating senior from Meadowbrook Heights who planned to pursue a career in law, public service, or community advocacy. The first recipient was Patricia Dunham's son, Michael, who'd been inspired by the whole HOA saga to study political science and public policy. At the award ceremony, he gave a short speech. "2 years ago, I watched what happened to my family and my neighbors. I saw people with power abuse that power, and I saw someone stand up and fight back. Mr. Norris showed me that one person with courage and persistence can change an entire system. That's what I want to do with my life. I want to help protect people from injustice and abuse." There wasn't a dry eye in the room. As the seasons changed again and another winter approached, I found myself thinking about how much had happened since that ice storm. My life had been relatively quiet before. I went to work, came home, maintained my house, and kept to myself mostly. The propane incident had pulled me out of that isolation and forced me to engage with my community in ways I never had before. In a strange way, I was grateful for it. Not grateful to Brenda Carmichael or for what she did, but grateful for the opportunity to make a real difference. How many people get a chance to fundamentally change their community for the better? The HOA continued to function well under Susan's leadership. The financial audits were clean. The improvements to common areas were completed on schedule and under budget. And homeowner satisfaction was at an all-time high according to a survey the board conducted. One Saturday morning in November, I was raking leaves when a car pulled up and a familiar figure got out. It took me a moment to recognize Sharon Whitmore. She looked older, more tired, and significantly less arrogant than the last time I'd seen her. "Quentin," she said, approaching hesitantly. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" I leaned on my rake. "All right." I wanted to apologize for everything that happened with the propane, for backing Brenda, for not standing up when I should have. This was unexpected. What brought this on? Therapy, mostly, and guilt. I've spent the last 2 years thinking about what happened. I knew what Brenda was doing wasn't right, but I went along with it because I was scared of her, and I liked being part of the inner circle. I convinced myself that you were being unreasonable, that you were the problem, because it was easier than admitting we were wrong. Did you know about the embezzlement? No. I swear I didn't. I'm not that far gone, but I should have questioned the finances more carefully. I should have stood up to her when she wanted to take your propane. I should have done a lot of things differently. I studied her for a moment. She seemed genuine. I appreciate the apology, Sharon. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong. For what it's worth, I'm glad you fought back. This neighborhood is better now than it ever was under Brenda's control. It is. But it took a lot of people working together to make it that way. She nodded, looking like she wanted to say more but couldn't find the words. Finally, she just said, "Thank you for not giving up," and walked back to her car. I watched her drive away, thinking about redemption and second chances. Sharon hadn't committed any crimes, but she'd been complicit in a toxic system. Now she was trying to make amends. That was worth something. The holidays approached again. 3 years since the ice storm, though it felt like a lifetime. The neighborhood holiday party was bigger than ever, with over 200 residents attending. The community center was decorated with lights and garlands. Tables groaned under the weight of potluck dishes, and a local band played music in the corner. Susan Rodriguez took the microphone at one point to make announcements and thank volunteers. At the end, she said something unexpected. "I want to take a moment to acknowledge someone who isn't here. 3 years ago, our neighborhood was in crisis. We had a board that had forgotten what service meant, and we had a situation that brought out the worst in people. But it also brought out the best." Quentin Norris stood up when it would have been easier to stay quiet. He fought back when most of us were too scared or too apathetic to act. Because of him, we learned that we have power as homeowners and as a community, so let's give him a round of applause. The applause was thunderous. I felt embarrassed but also deeply moved. Carl clapped me on the shoulder. "You earned this, my friend." After the party, walking home under the stars with my neighbors, I reflected on the journey. From watching my propane tank get stolen to standing in a community center being thanked by hundreds of people, it had been quite a ride. The legal cases were all closed now. Brenda was serving her time. The fines from the Corporation Commission had been paid. The HOA's finances were stable and transparent. The state had its new laws protecting homeowners. All the dominoes had fallen exactly as they should, but more than any of that, the community had changed. People were engaged now. They came to meetings, they volunteered, they held their elected representatives accountable. That was the real victory, the one that would last long after everyone forgot about the propane tanks and the ice storm. As I walked up my driveway and looked back at the street, I saw neighbors saying good night to each other, saw lights in windows, saw a community that actually functioned as a community. My propane tank sat securely beside my house, connected properly to my generator, ready for the next emergency. But I knew now that if another emergency came, we'd face it together. No one would have their property stolen. No one would be left in the cold, because we'd learned our lesson and we'd made sure it could never happen again. I went inside, poured myself a drink, and sat by the window looking out at the neighborhood. Somewhere out there, Brenda Carmichael was probably lying in a prison cell, maybe thinking about the choices that had led her there. I didn't hate her anymore. I almost felt sorry for her. She'd had power and respect, and she'd thrown it all away for money and ego. Meanwhile, I had something she never would. A community that trusted me, friends who stood beside me, and the knowledge that I'd done the right thing even when it was hard. The ice storm had been a test, one we'd initially failed but eventually passed. The real storm hadn't been the weather. It had been the corruption and abuse of power that the weather had exposed, and like any storm, it had eventually cleared, leaving behind a landscape forever changed. I raised my glass in a silent toast to everyone who'd been part of the journey. Carl and Margaret, Patricia and her son, Thomas Brennan, Jessica Young, George Patterson, Susan Rodriguez, and all the neighbors who'd stood up when it mattered. We'd taken a bad situation and made it better. We'd turned injustice into reform. We'd proven that ordinary people could defeat petty tyrants, and we'd done it all because someone stole my propane during a storm. The irony wasn't lost on me. Brenda had probably thought confiscating that tank would demonstrate her power and put me in my place. Instead, it had lit a fuse that burned through her entire corrupt operation. She'd pushed the wrong person at the wrong time, and it had cost her everything. As I finished my drink and got ready for bed, I thought about what advice I'd give to anyone else facing a similar situation. Stand up for yourself. Document everything. Don't be afraid to ask for help. Follow the rules and force others to do the same. Be persistent. And most importantly, remember that authority without accountability is just tyranny with paperwork. The next morning was Sunday, and I slept in for the first time in weeks. When I finally got up and made coffee, I checked my email and found a message from Thomas Brennan with a subject line that made me smile. Another HOA client needs help. Interested in consulting. I thought about it for about 10 seconds before replying. Send me the details. Because that's what you do when you've learned something valuable. You pass it on. You help others fight their battles. You pay it forward. My phone rang. It was Carl. Hey, a bunch of us are getting together for brunch at that new place on Main Street. You in? Absolutely. Give me 30 minutes. I got dressed, grabbed my keys, and headed out. The morning was clear and cold, typical Oklahoma November weather. My street looked peaceful, orderly, and most importantly, free from the corruption that had once plagued it. As I drove toward town, passing the entrance sign to Meadowbrook Heights that had been freshly painted by volunteers, I felt content in a way I never had before. Home wasn't just a house or even a neighborhood. It was a community of people who looked out for each other, who fought for what was right, and who refused to let bullies win. All because someone tried to steal my propane during a storm, and because I refused to let them get away with it.